Every city has a problem it cannot solve elegantly. For New York in the 1880s, it was the sheer mass of humanity trying to move through lower Manhattan simultaneously. For Chicago, it was the flatness of its grid combined with the ferocity of its river crossings. For St. Paul, Minnesota, the unsolvable problem had a name that appears in the engineering reports of the era with almost weary regularity: Cathedral Hill. The bluff rises roughly 120 feet above the river flats of downtown over a horizontal distance of less than half a mile. And that geometry, steep, consistent, unavoidable, sat directly across the path of every transit route that needed to connect the city's commercial core to its most densely populated residential neighborhoods to the west and north. The hill was not a natural disaster. It was not a flood or a fire or an epidemic. It was simply a fact of topography that the city had been failing to adequately address since its first horse-drawn streetcar lines were laid in the 1870s. By 1900, the failure had become operationally embarrassing. The cable car system that the Twin City Rapid Transit Company had installed on the Cathedral Hill grades in the early 1890s was aging, expensive to maintain, and chronically unreliable in the freeze-thaw conditions of a Minnesota winter. The cars, dependent on a continuously moving underground cable, gripped by a mechanism that functioned poorly when ice formed in the conduit slot, broke down at rates that the company's own service reports described, with bureaucratic restraint as unsatisfactory. During the winter of 1901, the Cathedral Hill cable line experienced 47 documented service interruptions between December and March. Passengers who relied on that line for their daily commute between the downtown office blocks and the residential streets of Ramsey Hill learned that winter a habit of calculation that became characteristic of the era. You built extra time into your journey, not because you expected the car to be late, but because you expected it to stop entirely, stranding you on a grade steep enough to make walking in ice and snow a genuine physical undertaking. The transit company knew the cable system was dying. The question was, what replaced it? And the answer, when it finally arrived from the engineering department in 1903, was so audacious that the board of directors reportedly requested that the chief engineer present it twice, once to make sure they had heard it correctly, and once to make sure the numbers were right. The answer was a tunnel, not a surface improvement, not an upgraded cable plant. A bore drilled through the living rock and clay beneath the city's streets, wide enough for an electric streetcar, long enough to bypass the grade problem entirely, deep enough to maintain a consistent alignment, regardless of what the weather was doing on the surface above. A subway in all but name, in a Midwestern city of 163,000 people at the turn of the 20th century. The proposal came from Fred A. Seabury, the TCRT's chief engineer, a man whose professional biography is frustratingly thin given the scale of what he built. His personnel file at the Minnesota Historical Society runs to 3 pages. No memoir, no biography, no portrait photograph that can be definitively identified as him. What survives is his work, the engineering reports, the construction specifications, the progress logs, the careful correspondence with contractors and city officials that traces the arc of the tunnel project from a proposal in a boardroom to a functioning underground transit system that would carry millions of passengers over the following 4.5 decades. Seabury's 1903 survey report is the founding document of the St. Paul tunnel system, and its opening sentence is worth quoting in full because it establishes the practical rather than visionary register in which the entire project would be conducted. The grades encountered on the approaches to the Union Depot via 3rd and 4th Streets have produced chronic delays to eastbound service during morning peak hours, particularly during winter conditions when the adhesion of the wheel to the rail cannot be relied upon for grades exceeding 6%. No rhetoric, no ambition. A problem statement, followed by a solution. That was the tunnel's origin, not a dream of civic grandeur, but the accumulated frustration of 47 service interruptions in a single winter. To understand what Seabury's team actually built, you have to start with the geology, because the geology is why the project was possible at all. St. Paul's downtown sits on a specific sequence of sedimentary rock that the glaciers of the last ice age left in a configuration almost uniquely suited to the kind of tunneling that early 20th century technology could accomplish. Below the topsoil and glacial till lies St. Peter sandstone, a formation of fine-grained, relatively uniform rock, deposited in a shallow sea roughly 450 million years ago, soft enough to be cut with hand tools and pneumatic equipment, stable enough to hold its shape in an excavated opening without immediate collapse. Above the sandstone capping the bluffs sits Platteville limestone, harder and more resistant, providing a natural overhead load-bearing arch above the tunnel's intended alignment. The combination was, in the language of a geotechnical engineer, favorable. In the language of someone who has ever tried to drive a bore through Chicago clay or New York's fractured schist, it was close to ideal. Seabury's team drilled test borings at 17 locations across the proposed tunnel alignments in the spring and summer of 1904, extracting core samples that were analyzed for compressive strength, moisture content, and the presence of the fractured zones and groundwater-bearing seams that represented the primary construction risks. The borings confirmed what the surface geology suggested. The St. Peter sandstone was consistent, the groundwater table was manageable, and the depth required to maintain adequate rock cover above the tunnel crown, roughly 25 to 35 feet below street grade along most of the alignment, was achievable without the deep shaft construction methods that would have dramatically escalated costs. The project was, on geological grounds, viable. What remained was the engineering. Construction of Tunnel Number 1 began in April 1906. The method was a combination of drill and blast in the harder limestone zones near the portal approaches and hand excavation with pneumatic tools in the sandstone body of the bore. Work proceeded simultaneously from both portal ends, with crews advancing the heading at rates that varied from as little as 6 feet per day in difficult ground to as many as 16 feet per day in clean sandstone. The overall average tracking across the full construction period was approximately 11 feet per day per heading, meaning that the two crews, working toward each other from opposite ends, were together advancing the bore by roughly 22 feet of completed tunnel on a good day. Progress reports submitted by foreman Carl Bjornstad at the Western Portal read like dispatches from a slow campaign. Made 9 feet today. Lost 2 hours to groundwater in the east face. Put in an extra course of brick and poured ahead anyway. Good work from the boys. The log entry is dated November 14th, 1906, and the temperature in St. Paul that day, according to the historical weather record, was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The two heading crews met on March 3, 1907, 91 feet off the planned meeting point. This kind of alignment error was not unusual for tunnel projects of the era. Survey instruments were precise, but translating surface survey control points into underground alignment over nearly 2,000 feet of bore introduced cumulative errors that even careful work could not entirely eliminate. The 91-foot discrepancy was corrected by accepting a slight horizontal curve in the alignment and adjusting the track geometry accordingly. The completed bore was 1,147 feet long, 9.5 feet wide at the widest point, and 8.2 feet tall at the crown of the arch. Maximum depth below street grade was 43 feet. The walls were lined with 2 courses of pressed brick over poured concrete. The floor was finished concrete with a central drainage channel running the full length of the bore. The overhead was fitted with a trolley wire suspension system custom designed for the tunnel's dimensional constraints, capable of maintaining the wire contact geometry that electric streetcar operation required through a range of temperatures that, in a Minnesota tunnel, spanned from the summer high of roughly 65 degrees to the winter low of approximately 48 degrees, a remarkably stable thermal environment compared to the surface world above. 3 additional tunnels followed. Tunnel number 2, authorized in 1912, completed 1914, at a cost of $387,000. Tunnel number 3, authorized in 1914, completed 1915 at $299,000, the shortest of the four at approximately 200 feet, addressing a specific grade problem on the Capital Approach routing. Tunnel number 4, authorized 1915, completed 1917 at $520,000, the most expensive, built under wartime labor conditions, and through a section of ground that produced the most significant construction difficulties of any of the four bores, including a 9-day stoppage in November 1916 when a section of the heading face collapsed and required extensive timber shoring before work could resume. The total investment across all four bores, approximately $1.66 million, equivalent in present purchasing power to something in the range of $38 million. For a transit company operating on 5-cent fares with a structurally frozen revenue base, it was an enormous commitment. The board of directors who approved it were either very confident in the long-term future of urban rail transit or very aware that there was no realistic alternative, probably both. The tunnel opened to revenue service on April 22, 1908. The Pioneer Press gave it 3 paragraphs on page 12. The tone was matter-of-fact, to the point of near indifference. Service on the Selby Lake route was now operating via the new underground bore. Journey times were reduced by several minutes. The grade problem was resolved. No ceremony, no ribbon cutting that any record documents. No statement from the mayor. The city's newspaper, confronted with what was by any objective measure a remarkable piece of infrastructure, an underground electric railway in a mid-sized Midwestern city at the dawn of the automobile age, responded with the prose equivalent of a shrug. The riders responded differently. Ridership on the tunnel section of the Selby Lake line exceeded projections within the first month of operation and continued to run ahead of equivalent surface mileage throughout the pre-war period. The TCRT's 1912 annual report shows the tunnel section carrying 4,800 passengers per weekday on average, against 3,100 for comparable surface line mileage on the same route. The differential was larger in winter and smaller in summer, which was exactly the pattern the engineering projections had anticipated. But the numbers, however informative, do not capture what the tunnel actually meant to the people who used it daily. And for that, the most useful source is not a spreadsheet, but a man named Raymond Hennessy. Hennessy was hired by the TCRT in 1938 at age 22, following his father into the company in the tradition of transit families of the era. By 1941, he was assigned to the tunnel routes, a senior assignment in the union's seniority system, reflecting both the skill the grades required and the general desirability of the position among drivers who had spent years on exposed surface lines through Minnesota winters. He drove the Selby Lake Tunnel section in various assignments for approximately 11 of his 14 years with the company. His oral history, recorded in 1974 by a University of Minnesota transportation researcher and archived at the Hennepin History Museum, is one of the most complete first-person accounts of what the St. Paul Underground was actually like from the inside. The thing people never understood about driving the tunnel was the sound, Hennessy said. On the surface, you had the noise of the city all around you, the automobiles, the people, the wind, and the car sounds were just part of it. In the tunnel, the car was everything. You could hear the wheels on the rail in a way you never heard them outside. Every little variation in the track, the joints, the curves, experienced drivers got, so they knew the whole board just by sound. I could tell you exactly where I was in tunnel number 1, without looking at the wall markers. I knew it that well. The brick had a different resonance than the concrete sections. The curve before the east portal had a particular squeal in wet weather. You learned it the way you learn anything you do every day for years. What Hennessy describes is a sensory landscape so specific and so complete that it constitutes, in archaeological terms, a record of material culture transmitted through memory rather than object. The particular squeal of the east portal curve in wet weather is not in any maintenance log. The different resonance of brick versus concrete is not in any engineering specification. These are facts about the tunnel that exist only because a man drove through it 11,000 times and remembered what he heard, and because someone thought to ask him about it 22 years after he last made that drive. The oral history is the artifact. The tunnel, sealed and inaccessible, produced Hennessy as its record keeper, without ever intending to, and Hennessy, speaking in 1974, had no way of knowing that his memories would become the primary sensory documentation of a space that would remain physically sealed for at least another half-century beyond the date of the interview. The passengers that Hennessy describes form a social portrait of the tunnel's daily life that no ridership statistic can replicate. The commuters who claim the same positions in the car every morning with the territorial confidence of long habit. The Cathedral Hill nurses in their capes who boarded at the West Portal stop in all weather. The children at the front windows, watching the headlamp resolve the tunnel's darkness into oncoming brick. And the heat, always, in Hennessy's account, the heat. Not the oppressive heat of a crowded enclosed space, but the warmth of a consistent subsurface temperature, in a city where January meant genuine cold, where 11 below zero was a number that appeared in the newspaper, not as a record, but as a forecast. The tunnel was 52 degrees in February. The surface was not. That differential, experienced daily by thousands of riders over 4 decades, produced a loyalty to the underground routes that no amount of fair comparison or journey time analysis fully explains. The TCRT's relationship with its tunnel system was, from the moment of construction, the relationship of a business with a beloved liability. The tunnels worked brilliantly as transit infrastructure and imperfectly as financial instruments, and that tension never resolved itself in the tunnel's favor. Understanding why requires a brief excursion into the economic structure of American urban transit in the early 20th century, an excursion that helps explain not just what happened in St. Paul, but why the same story, in different topographic variations, played out in city after city across the country in the decades that followed. Street railway franchises of the era were granted by municipal governments under terms that typically included fare caps, limitations on what the company could charge per ride, established at the time the franchise was negotiated and extremely difficult to revise upward thereafter. In St. Paul, as in most cities, the cap was 5 cents, a nickel. The nickel fare had been established when the city was smaller, labor was cheaper, and the cost of operating a horse-drawn streetcar on a simple surface route was the primary variable in the company's cost structure. By 1910, none of those conditions still obtained. The company was operating an electrified system with significant capital investment in track, overhead wire, substations, and rolling stock. Labor costs were rising with the organizing efforts of transit workers' unions. Maintenance costs were climbing as the original infrastructure aged, and the nickel fare, locked in place by franchise agreements that the city had no incentive to renegotiate, produced revenue that grew only as fast as ridership grew, which was not fast enough to keep pace with the cost increases. Into this already strained financial environment, the tunnels introduced a cost structure that was qualitatively different from anything else in the system. Surface streetcar lines required track, wire, and rolling stock. The tunnels required all of that plus the tunnel structure itself. The brick lining, the drainage systems, the ventilation fans, the specialized overhead wire configuration, the portal structures, and the ongoing maintenance of an underground environment where minor problems, a seep in the brick lining, a blocked drainage channel, a ventilation fan bearing beginning to fail, could become major problems if not addressed promptly. The 1912 company treasurer's remark, preserved in the annual meeting minutes, cuts to the core of it. We are in the position of a business that has found a way to serve its customers better, and for which that improvement costs more than it returns. The tunnel is a service success and a financial problem simultaneously. That sentence could have served as the epitaph for urban rail transit in America if anyone had been paying attention to it at the time. The wartime ridership surge of 1941 to 1945 briefly obscured the structural problem. Gasoline rationing, tire rationing, and the wartime employment boom pushed TCRT ridership to levels not seen since 1918. The tunnel lines carried more passengers in 1943 than in any year since the system's peak, and the company's annual reports from those years have an optimistic tone that reads, in retrospect, like a man counting his savings without accounting for what he owes. Management believed, or at least recorded a belief, that post-war conditions would sustain the wartime ridership gains. They were wrong in the most decisive possible way. Between 1945 and 1952, the TCRT converted 31 of its 62 streetcar routes to bus operation. The tunnel lines survived longer than most, partly because their sunk costs made conversion look expensive on a spreadsheet, and partly because the tunnel clearances were too tight for the standard transit bus of the era. But by 1951, the logic of the transition was inescapable. The tunnels had been built for rail. The future belonged to rubber tires. The infrastructure was, in the bloodless vocabulary of mid-century planning, stranded. The last revenue car ran through Tunnel Number 1 on the night of May 16, 1952. Raymond Hennessy was the driver. He did not know it was the last run until his dispatcher told him at the end of the shift, and he did not have the opportunity to go back the next morning and look at the tunnel the way you look at a place when you know you are seeing it for the last time. The dispatcher's notification was the last professional contact between a human being and the operational tunnel system. 3 days later, the TCRT filed its abandonment notice with the St. Paul Department of Public Works. 3 weeks after that, the portals were sealed. The city engineer who handled the closure process, Wallace H. Pratt, produced an inspection report on June 6, 1952, that is one of the more consequential 5-page documents in St. Paul's administrative history. Pratt found the tunnels structurally sound. The brick lining was intact in all 4 bores. The drainage channels were functioning. The track was in place, the overhead wire having already been removed by the TCRT as part of its asset liquidation. The tunnel floors were clear. Pratt's recommendation was characteristically pragmatic. Seal the portals with concrete, maintain the existing drainage connections to the municipal storm sewer. Leave the bores undisturbed. His reasoning was financial as much as structural. Filling the tunnels would be expensive and would create subsidence risks, while maintaining open access would generate liability exposure. The seal was the cheapest responsible option. They may, in future years, prove valuable for utility routing or other municipal purposes, Pratt wrote, at which time a more thorough assessment can be undertaken. That assessment has not been undertaken. The portals were sealed in late June 1952. 6 photographs of the sealing operation survive in the Ramsey County Historical Society's collections. Utilitarian work documentation images showing concrete forms, a transit mixer, and workers completing a task that apparently warranted no more archival attention than repaving a parking lot. In 2 of the photographs, visible through the formwork, the dark interior of the bore is briefly, partially visible before the concrete closes it off. No one photographed the inside. No one walked the length of the bores to document what was there. The closure was handled with the same institutional efficiency and the same indifference to historical record that characterized the management of transit infrastructure across the country in the post-war years, when the future was assumed to belong to automobiles, and the past was something to be sealed and moved past as briskly as possible. What the 1952 sealing left inside the tunnels was not nothing. The TCRT's asset recovery process removed the overhead wire, which was copper and therefore valuable. Everything else, the track, the signal equipment brackets, the wall-mounted emergency telephones, the ventilation duct supports, the drainage gratings, the distance markers that Bjornstad's crew had painted on the brick walls in the winter of 1907 at 50-foot intervals, was simply abandoned in place. Not buried, not demolished. Left in the specific way that items are left when the institution managing them concludes that retrieval costs more than the items are worth and that someone else can deal with them eventually. The someone else has not yet arrived. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by Ramsey County between 2009 and 2014, commissioned for routine infrastructure risk assessment before utility work, returned reflections that the technicians initially flagged as anomalies, too geometrically regular for natural voids, too consistent for the kind of irregular cavities that develop in karst or settled fill, rectangular cross-sections at depths of 30 to 60 feet with metallic reflections at regular intervals along the estimated floor plane, spaced approximately 4 feet apart in two parallel lines. The interpretation requires no specialist knowledge. Rails, still embedded in the concrete trackbed, still conducting enough electromagnetic signal to register on a survey instrument, 6 decades after the last car passed over them. The radar surveys were filed in the Public Works Archive. No follow-up assessment was commissioned. The notation in the survey records reads, "Suspected man-made structure. No corresponding record in current utility inventory." In October 2019, a sewer maintenance crew working on a storm drain connection near the estimated midpoint of Tunnel Number 2 broke through into what their incident report describes as a brick-lined void space of significant dimensions. The crew was not equipped for tunnel inspection. They did not enter. The supervisor filed a notation, and the opening was repaired with a concrete plug within 48 hours. The crew's description of what they saw through the opening, a section of brick wall, a length of iron rail, approximately 30 feet below grade, is the most recent direct visual documentation of the tunnel interior that exists in the public record. The incident report is dated October 11, 2019. There's no follow-up notation in the maintenance log. Return, at the end of this, to Kellogg Boulevard, the retaining wall, the seam in the concrete where the aggregate changes texture, and the pour dates differ by decades. The rectangular outline, 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, beveled at the corners, that marks the location of a sealed portal that has been sealed for more than 70 years. The boulevard traffic moves past it on the surface. The pedestrians who know what to look for can find the seam. Those who don't, and that is nearly everyone, walk past a concrete wall and see a concrete wall. There is a proposal, surfacing periodically in the St. Paul Heritage Preservation Commission, minutes every 5 to 8 years, to open a section of the tunnel system for guided historical access. The most recent version, discussed in 2021, produced a preliminary engineering cost estimate of $180,000 for portal assessment and limited access preparation. A consulting firm was identified. A draft interpretive program was sketched out, describing what visitors might see: the brick-lined bore, the intact track, the distance markers on the walls, the physical evidence of a transit system that operated for 46 years and closed without leaving a visible trace on the surface of the city it had served. The proposal was tabled when pandemic-era budget constraints arrived. The commission minutes contain no motion to revisit it. What makes the sealed tunnels of St. Paul different from the hundreds of other pieces of decommissioned urban infrastructure that lie beneath American cities, the abandoned subway stations, the sealed rail alignments, the buried river channels, is not their size or their age or their historical significance, though all three of those are considerable. What makes them different is the quality of uncertainty that surrounds them. Most abandoned infrastructure has been documented at closure, surveyed at intervals, photographed at decommissioning. The St. Paul tunnels were sealed in June 1952 with no interior documentation, monitored at intervals sufficient to maintain the portal seals, but not sufficient to produce any record of interior conditions, and periodically rediscovered by utility crews who repair the accidental openings and file incident reports that generate no follow-up. The institutional awareness of the tunnels is just enough to keep them sealed. It is not enough to know what is inside them. Raymond Hennessy, speaking in 1974, described the mineral smell of the underground, the specific combination of damp brick, rail oil, and circulated air, as something he associated for the rest of his life with the tunnel routes. That smell is not in any document. The distance markers painted on the brick walls are not in any photograph. The particular squeal of the east portal curve in wet weather is not in any maintenance log. These are real things, physical facts about a physical space, that exist in the historical record only as memories, and the last person who held those memories as direct experience, rather than secondhand testimony, was Hennessy, who died in 1991. What he remembered is now gone, in the way that first-hand memory goes, irreversibly, without substitution. What remains below the street and behind the concrete portal, and in the dark of a bore that has been sealed since Truman was president, is a structure. Brick and concrete and steel rail, in an environment stable enough that decay has been slower than the surface world would suggest. 70 years of darkness and controlled humidity and the particular stillness of an enclosed underground space. The 2019 sewer crew saw brick wall and iron rail. The radar technicians in 2014 saw metallic reflections at 4-foot intervals in 2 parallel lines. These are not rumors or estimates, they are measurements. The track is there. Whether what is there constitutes a ruin, a time capsule, a stranded asset awaiting a future use, or simply a portion of the city's buried past that will remain buried until a utility excavation or a structural failure makes the decision for whoever is governing St. Paul at the time. That is a question the available evidence cannot resolve. The map ends at the concrete portal. The portal has been sealed since June 1952. Inside it, somewhere in the dark, at 43 feet below grade, Carl Bjornstad's distance markers are still on the wall, measuring out the bore in 50-foot increments, counting down to a portal that no one has entered from that side in more than 7 decades. The hill that broke the streetcar is still there. The tunnel that went through it is still there too. The city built above both of them has largely forgotten that one of them was ever a solution to the other. That forgetting is, in its own way, the most complete document the tunnels have produced. The record of how a city moves past the infrastructure it no longer needs, smoothly and without ceremony, leaving behind only a seam in the concrete and a question that the map, for now, declines to answer.